Well, everyone, we get to finally talk about another Google Pixel, and this was actually the second Pixel technically that ever came out. It was the Google Pixel XL. Now, it was the first time a Pixel ever got really announced and released, but this was the bigger model at that time. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Pixel phone lineup was pretty much the Nexus successor. I love the Nexus phone. I owned and used the Nexus 4 for about 2 years, and I had a tremendous time with it. And with the Pixel XL, this really was the direct successor, I think, more so than the Nexus lineup, to the Nexus 5X and the Nexus 6P. Those phones came out at the same time too, but they were like different devices. There was the 5X and the 6P, and they were really different. The 6P was definitely a really good phone, but until it had all those issues, the Pixel XL was literally just a bigger phone of the Pixel, which I actually found kind of cool. I didn't like having a bunch of phones that had so many different, components, and the bigger one was so much bigger and better than the other one. Really, the best thing you were getting for the Pixel XL was the bigger battery and obviously, the bigger display if you like it, but I still think the original Pixel is a very good phone, and I think the Pixel XL also sits in that category as well. Now, I wouldn't really recommend, choosing this as your first choice. If you're willing to custom ROM it, then that's different, but if you're not willing to do it, I would highly recommend buying something like a Pixel 5, even a Pixel 4 I would recommend than this one, to be honest, but the choice is yours. Now, on the outside, you did have a 5.5-inch AMOLED display on the front. It's 1440p. And I'm gonna tell you, the panel of this phone isn't bad. I actually thought the panel of this phone, even when it first came out, was actually pretty good. And I didn't buy the original Pixel XL, but I did buy the original Pixel when that came out. And here's the issue with the Pixel XL. You have a ton of bezel around this phone. And when you look at the phone, this phone came out in 2016. When you look at even phones from 2017, this phone came out at a horrible time because 2017, we started seeing these phones really reduce the bezels. We saw them, go from, the Galaxy S7 to the Galaxy S8, the iPhone 7 Plus to the iPhone 10. We saw a lot of phones starting to remove the bezel around this. And with the Pixel XL, literally within a few months, it already looked extremely outdated. And that was kind of a sad thing about the original Pixel XL. But then with the Pixel 2 and 2 XL, well, the Pixel 2 XL, Google did a great job at that design. But with this one, tons of bezel, and it really did date this phone. Now, you have the USB Type-C port on the bottom, which was great, and you had a headphone jack too, which was also really cool to have. I think they kept it on the Pixel 2 XL, but then they removed it with the Pixel 3. It was some variation of that. And on the back, we had this half, kind of 70% aluminum back, and then like a glass portion up top, which I actually thought was pretty cool. It looked pretty good. It definitely didn't look ugly or anything, but the problem with this type of, back was that we didn't have wireless charging for this phone. Now, I don't even use wireless charging anymore. I think some of you may know how I feel about it, but it's still nice to have that feature for those of you who want to do it. This phone doesn't have it, but it's okay, I guess. This phone didn't have any IP certification, but it did have water repellent coating, so maybe you could take a splash here and there. You had Gorilla Glass, which most phones have nowadays, but I still think this phone, feels very premium. I just don't think it looks very good anymore, if I'm going to be completely honest. But one of the biggest advantages about the Pixel lineup when it first came out was the camera. Now, the Nexus lineup was notorious of having really bad cameras, and I owned a Nexus 4, and that phone didn't really have that good of a camera either. But the Google Pixel, when this phone came out, so many people were overhyping, and I wouldn't even say overhyping, they were hyping up this camera like crazy. It was a single 12.3 megapixel camera on the back, and it was an 8 megapixel camera on the front. No portion of this camera could do 4K at 60, but a lot of phones at that time couldn't do 4K at 60 either, so totally understandable. But at this time, Google, I think, spent a lot of marketing dollars at hyping up this camera, and a ton of reviewers at that time were hyping up this camera too, and people were super happy about this. And if you guys remember, the Pixel lineup at this time was notorious of having the best camera. They had the best image quality, best videos, best everything. And I remember hearing a lot of people talk about that at that time. Now, I still think Samsung's at the top. Maybe iPhones are kind of there sometimes, but nobody really brings up the Pixel as having the best camera anymore. But at this moment, this was the reason to buy this phone, if I remember correctly. People were so happy. And when I owned that Google Pixel at that moment, I was really happy with the camera. I didn't really use my camera like that every day, but from what everyone heard, it seemed like a really good camera. And when I compared it to my, I think, iPhone 6s Plus at the time, I think it was a really good camera too. I didn't own the 7 Plus by that point, but now I still think this camera is pretty good. But the biggest downside of this camera is that the lack of extra sensors. We don't have a wide angle lens or a telephoto lens or anything like that. And with an iPhone 7 Plus at this moment, it came out the same time around as the Pixel XL. We had multiple camera sensors. We had that telephoto lens. With this one, we didn't have that capability, which was a pretty big downside in my opinion. So when it comes down to the camera side, I think for a 2016 phone, this phone is probably one of the best cameras of that moment. And even going into 2017, it was probably the best camera of 2017 as well. But its biggest problem was probably the single sensor. By that point, we already had multiple cameras and all that stuff, but it would have been nice had we had an extra camera sensor, and we didn't really have that here, but still, very, very good camera for sure. Now, in terms of software, this was the best reason to go and buy and pick up a Google Pixel. I mean, this phone had stock Android, and even now, it's still one of the best reasons to buy one of these phones. It has so much capability in that standpoint, and I am such a huge fan of phones that have this type of, software set, have this type of features, and with stock Android, you can't really go wrong with it. You can customize it however you want to, and I prefer something like stock Android more so than any other version of Android, if I'm being honest, and some people have it differently. Some people like One UI more than, stock Android. It's totally up to you. It's totally your preference. I prefer stock Android, and you still have the ability of custom ROMing this phone too if you choose to do so. So you have a lot of capability with this phone still, and I'm a humongous fan of that without a doubt. Now, moving on to the performance side of things, this phone had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 821 chipset inside of it with 4GB of RAM, and as I mentioned at that point and how I'll mention it now, this phone at that moment was a very fast performing phone in my opinion. It had, I believe, the best chipset of that year for Qualcomm, and I think this phone's performance was still pretty good. Maybe it wasn't perfect, as most of us know, but I think for a majority of us out there, we would be really happy with having a phone like this with this type of performance, And I still think in this day and age, when you're getting a phone like the Google Pixel XL, you can't really go wrong with it like I mentioned, I think this phone had a lot of capability at that moment, and really anything you would do with it at that moment, was probably really good. Nowadays, it is starting to show its age a little bit. Things are a little glitchy, things are a little stuttery here and there, but when you remember that this is about a 6-year-old phone right now, you start to remember, it totally is understandable why this phone may not be the best here, or why it may not be performing the best here, and you pretty much move on in that area. So I'm really not complaining too much about this phone's type of performance there. It is kind of showing its age a little bit, but when you compare it to other phones that came out in 2016, like the Galaxy S7 or the iPhone 7, it kind of makes a little bit more sense, and it's really not that big of a deal. So without a doubt, that pretty much covers it up there. And I'll go ahead and hit on the battery life too. This phone had a 3,450 milliamp-hour battery, and as I mentioned then, and I'll mention it now, definitely not like the craziest battery life now, but at that moment, it was a bigger phone with a bigger size battery. So a lot of people preferred that, and they were really happy with that battery size too. So that's another big thing to keep in mind. And without a doubt, I will definitely tell you, the Google Pixel XL, I think, was a very good phone when it first came out, and I still think it's still a legendary phone in so many different ways. I don't think this is necessarily the first phone I would recommend people to buy, but if you still own this phone, I mean, it's not like you have a very, very outdated phone, but do keep in mind that you're, already behind on several versions of Android. Leaks of Android 13 have already came out, so it doesn't really make any sense to purposely go out and buy this phone. I would much rather recommend you to go and buy like a Pixel 4, Pixel 4a, Pixel 5, one of those types of phones that's still going to be supported for a little bit of time. I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy the Pixel XL, but it's still really cool to kind of pick up a phone like this, kind of maneuver around with it, and see what it can possibly do. So without a doubt, that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.